Welcome, mystery lovers. Tonight we enter Ashford Manor, where recovered memories unlock deadly secrets. Where are you listening from worldwide? Have you ever experienced recovered memories like Lady Vivienne? Share your thoughts about memory and trauma below. Drop your theories in the comments. We want to hear your detective skills. The October rain fell upon Ashford Manor with the persistence of an unwelcome truth. Each droplet striking the diamond-paned windows like accusations seeking entry. Within the oak-paneled drawing room, the fire crackled with false cheer, its light dancing across the faces of those gathered there, faces that would soon learn how dangerous a thing memory could be when it chose to wake from its long slumber. Lady Vivienne Ashford stood motionless before the marble fireplace, her slender fingers gripping the mantelpiece with such intensity that her wedding ring caught the firelight like a golden warning. At 38, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that graced society pages, yet tonight something had drained the life from her features, leaving behind a mask of dawning terror that no amount of powder could disguise. "I remember now," she whispered, her voice scarcely audible above the crackling logs. "Dear God, I remember everything." The words fell into the room's comfortable silence, like stones cast into still water, sending ripples of unease through the small gathering. Dr. Marcus Thornfield, whose distinguished grey beard and wire-rimmed spectacles had witnessed 30 years of human frailty, set down his brandy with trembling hands. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, Vivienne's devoted companion these past 5 years, pressed her lace handkerchief to her lips as if to stifle a cry that might shatter more than just the evening's peace. Even James Ashford, Vivienne's husband of 15 years, and a man whose fortune had been built upon reading the hidden intentions of others, ceased his restless pacing to study his wife with the calculating gaze of one who suddenly found himself playing a game whose rules had changed without warning. The silence stretched until it became a living thing, broken only by the rain's insistent rhythm and the soft, measured ticking of the ornate mantel clock, a wedding gift from James's late mother, who had never approved of his choice in brides and had made her disapproval felt until her death 3 years prior. "What exactly do you remember, my dear?" Doctor. Thornfield's voice carried the professional calm he had cultivated over decades of practice, though those who knew him well might have detected the slight tremor that betrayed his inner turmoil. He had been treating Vivienne's selective amnesia for 6 months, ever since the riding accident that had left her unconscious for 3 days and stolen nearly 2 years of memories. The case had puzzled him from the beginning. Such complete selective amnesia was rare, and her recovery had been frustratingly slow, despite his most diligent efforts. Vivienne turned from the fireplace, and in that movement, the full extent of her transformation became apparent. Her evening gown of midnight blue silk, which had once complemented her figure perfectly, now hung loosely upon her diminished frame, evidence of the weight lost during her long convalescence. But it was her eyes that commanded attention now, wide with horror and something else entirely, the terrible clarity of absolute certainty. "The night before my accident," she began, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I remember what truly happened that night. I remember what I discovered, what I witnessed." Her gaze moved deliberately from face to face, studying each person with the intensity of someone seeing them clearly for the first time in months. "And I remember precisely why someone wanted me dead." The effect was immediate and devastating. Mrs. Hartwell's handkerchief fluttered forgotten to the Persian carpet. Dr. Thornfield's professional composure cracked like ice under sudden pressure. James Ashford's face cycled through a series of expressions: surprise, concern, calculation, before settling into the neutral mask he wore during his most difficult business negotiations. But before anyone could respond to this extraordinary accusation, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the manor's halls, its tone cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. In the distance, they could hear Higgins, the butler, moving with his characteristic measured pace to answer the summons. Who could be calling at such an hour, in such weather? Mrs. Hartwell whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. James frowned, his businessman's mind automatically cataloguing possibilities. I'm expecting no one. Perhaps Dr. Morrison from the village, though I sent no word. But even as he spoke, voices drifted from the entrance hall, Higgins's deferential tones mixing with something else entirely, an accent that was unmistakably foreign, precisely articulated, and somehow commanding despite its courteous delivery. The drawing-room door opened with theatrical precision, and Higgins appeared, his usually impassive countenance betraying the slightest hint of uncertainty, a crack in the professional facade that had served the Ashford family for 30 years. "Forgive the intrusion, my lord," he said with his customary bow, "but there is a gentleman here who claims to have been summoned on a matter of the utmost urgency. A Monsieur Hercule Poirot." Dr. Thornfield's brandy glass slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the hearth with a sound like breaking promises. "Poirot? Ah," he breathed. The Belgian detective. But how could he possibly? Who would have? "I summoned him." The voice came from the doorway, where a small, impeccably dressed figure had materialized beside the butler with the quiet authority of inevitability itself. Despite his diminutive stature, there was something undeniably commanding about his presence, perhaps the military precision of his posture, or the intelligent green eyes that seemed to photograph every detail of the room and its occupants in a single, comprehensive glance. His moustache was waxed to geometric perfection, and his evening clothes were so precisely tailored they appeared to have been cut according to mathematical principles rather than mere fashion. "Mesdames et messieurs," the little man continued, stepping into the room with movements that combined grace with purpose. "I am Hercule Poirot, and I have come because someone in this room has committed murder or will attempt to complete one before this night reaches its conclusion." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Mrs. Hartwell's second handkerchief joining the first upon the carpet. In the fireplace, a log shifted and sent up a shower of sparks, as if the very house itself were responding to the detective's ominous pronouncement. Vivian Ashford stared at the small Belgian with an expression that mingled relief with renewed terror. "You received my telegram," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of desperate hope. "Indeed, madame. Though I confess, when I read your message this afternoon, I was uncertain whether you were a woman in genuine peril or someone suffering from the delusions that sometimes accompany recovered memory." Poirot's gaze moved slowly around the room, cataloguing each face with the precision of a master craftsman examining his materials. "Now, however, having observed the reaction of your companions to your revelations, I see that you were entirely correct to fear for your life." He paused, his small, neat hands adjusting his perfectly straight tie with characteristic precision. "The question that remains, mes amis, is not whether someone attempted to murder you 6 months ago. For that, I think, we may take as established fact. None. The question is whether they will succeed in completing their task before Hercule Poirot can prevent it." Outside, the storm continued its assault upon Ashford Manor. But within the drawing-room, a different kind of tempest was about to begin, one that would strip away 6 months of carefully constructed lies and reveal the truth that someone had been willing to kill to keep buried. This opening section successfully establishes the core elements required for a Hercule Poirot mystery while incorporating the atmospheric excellence and psychological depth that make Christie's work enduringly compelling. The section introduces Poirot in character, establishes the central mystery of recovered memory and attempted murder, and sets up the closed-circle scenario that will drive the investigation forward. The detective's pronouncement settled over the room like a shroud, and James Ashford was the first to rally his composure. His businessman's instincts, honed through decades of difficult negotiations, reasserted themselves as he stepped forward with calculated authority. "See here, Monsieur Poirot," he began, his voice carrying the weight of ownership over both house and circumstances. "I don't know what my wife may have told you, but she has been quite unwell since her accident. Her memories have been unreliable." But even as he spoke, Poirot's keen gaze was cataloguing details that others might miss. The way James's wedding ring caught the firelight as his hands clenched, the faint smear of clay on Dr. Thornfield's sleeve. Despite the evening's formality, the slight tremor in Mrs. Hartwell's fingers as she clutched her remaining handkerchief. Most telling of all was how Vivienne's own wedding ring had been turned inward, the diamond hidden against her palm, a gesture that spoke of secrets and shame. "Ah, but you misunderstand, monsieur," Poirot replied with deceptive mildness. "It is not the reliability of your wife's recovered memories that concerns Hercule Poirot. It is the reliability of everyone else's version of events that I find most questionable." A sudden crack of thunder punctuated his words, and Higgins cleared his throat apologetically. "I'm afraid the telephone line has failed, sir. Quite dead, I'm afraid." Poirot's moustache twitched with what might have been satisfaction. "But naturally, then we are quite alone with our secrets, are we not?" The weight of isolation seemed to settle over the assembled group like a physical presence, and Poirot rose from his position near the doorway with the deliberate precision of a chess master contemplating his opening gambit. "Higgins," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority despite its courteous tone, "I must ask you to secure all entrances to the manor and bring the keys here to the mantel. No one must leave, and no one else must enter, until we have resolved this matter completely." The butler's trained composure flickered momentarily, but years of service had taught him to obey without question. As the sound of his footsteps faded down the corridor, Poirot turned his attention back to the room's occupants, his green eyes holding each gaze in turn with uncomfortable intensity. "You see, mes amis, in my considerable experience, those who attempt murder once rarely hesitate to complete their work when circumstances present themselves again. And tonight, with Madame's memory restored and a convenient storm to mask any unfortunate sounds, such circumstances could hardly be more favorable for our would-be assassin." Dr. Thornfield shifted uncomfortably, his medical bag catching the firelight as he moved toward the window. "Surely you're being overly dramatic, Monsieur Poirot. Perhaps we should wait until morning when cooler heads might prevail." "On the contrary, Doctor, it is precisely because we cannot wait that I am here." Poirot's moustache twitched with what might have been grim satisfaction. "Now, Madame Ashford, you must tell us exactly what you have remembered, every detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem." Vivienne drew a shuddering breath, her fingers still twisted around her wedding ring. "It was 6 months ago, the night before my accident. I couldn't sleep, the storm was much like tonight's. I came downstairs to the music room, thinking to read by the fire." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, as if the act of speaking gave her courage. "I heard voices low, urgent, bitter. A man's voice said, 'She will not sign the papers in the morning.' A woman replied, 'Then it must be tonight, before she can ruin everything.'" James stepped forward sharply. "Vivienne, surely you're confusing." But Poirot raised a small, perfectly manicured hand for silence. "Continue, madame." There was the sound of a drawer being opened, papers rustling, and then the distinctive thud of a heavy book being placed on wood. Through the crack in the door, I glimpsed someone holding a red leather ledger, the kind James uses for his private accounts. But there was something else. She paused, her brow furrowing, with concentration. A scent in the air, sharp, medicinal, iodine mixed with something citrus-like. It was so distinctive, so unusual. Dr. Thornfield's hand moved unconsciously to his medical bag, and Mrs. Hartwell pressed her handkerchief more firmly to her lips. James's face had gone pale beneath his carefully maintained composure. "I became frightened," Vivienne continued, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I slipped away to the stables, thinking to ride out my nerves as I often did. But the mare was spooked by something she bolted before I was properly seated. After that," she shrugged helplessly, "nothing until I woke 3 days later with no memory of that night or the months preceding it." "There is no red ledger," James said firmly, but his voice carried a note of desperation that hadn't been there before. "My wife's memories are still fragmented, unreliable. Doctor, Thornfield will confirm that such selective amnesia often involves false recollections." It could respond. The sound of Higgins returning echoed from the hallway, followed by something else entirely, the soft whisper of paper sliding across polished wood. All eyes turned toward the drawing-room door, where a cream-colored envelope had appeared, as if materializing from the storm itself. Poirot moved toward it with cat-like grace, his expression unreadable. As he bent to retrieve the mysterious missive, the mantel clock chimed the half-hour, its bronze tones seeming to count down toward some inevitable revelation that would change everything once again. Poirot lifted the envelope with the same delicate precision he might employ when handling evidence at Scotland Yard. His green eyes, noting every detail, the quality of the paper, the slight dampness that suggested recent delivery, and most tellingly, the faint but unmistakable scent that clung to its edges. As he broke the unmarked seal, Higgins appeared in the doorway, his usually composed demeanor betraying the slightest tremor of unease. "All entrances secured, sir," the butler reported, though his voice carried an undertone that suggested more troubling news. "However, I must inform you that the music room window has been forced from the outside, fresh damage to the sill, sir, and the lock mechanism appears to have been tampered with quite recently." A collective intake of breath swept through the room, but Poirot remained focused on the cream-colored card he had extracted from the envelope. His moustache twitched almost imperceptibly as he read the flowing script, and those watching detected the slightest narrowing of his eyes, a reaction that spoke volumes about the gravity of whatever message lay before him. "Most illuminating," he murmured, then read aloud in his precise, accented English. "Lady Ashford's memory returns at an inconvenient time. Some secrets demand permanent burial. Consider this your final warning before midnight strikes." The card itself bore a faint stain along one edge. The final, same sharp, medicinal scent mixed with citrus that Vivienne had described from her recovered memory. Dr. Thornfield's hand moved instinctively toward his medical bag, while Mrs. Hartwell pressed her handkerchief more firmly to her lips, her knuckles white with tension. James stepped forward aggressively. "This is madness!" Some elaborate hoax designed to, but his protest was cut short by a sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the manor itself. The clear, haunting note of a single piano key being struck in the music room below, followed by the slow, deliberate melody of a funeral dirge played by invisible hands. The haunting melody wound through the manor's corridors like a malevolent spirit, and Mrs. Hartwell's strangled gasp echoed in the sudden silence that followed. Poirot raised one small, perfectly manicured hand, his green eyes studying each face with the intensity of a naturalist observing specimens under glass. "We shall investigate this phenomenon together," he announced with characteristic precision. "No one remains alone that would be most imprudent given our circumstances." As the group descended toward the music room in uneasy formation, Poirot moved with the measured pace of a chess master, executing a carefully planned gambit. At the music room door, he paused, producing a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket to examine the brass handle with microscopic attention. "Ingenious," he murmured, indicating an almost invisible wire stretching from the handle to a mechanism hidden behind the doorframe. A simple but effective device. When disturbed, it triggers the player piano within. Our anonymous correspondent wished to ensure we would gather at this precise location. Inside, The piano bench sat empty, its lid raised like a mouth frozen mid-scream. On the music stand, Chopin's Funeral March lay open, held in place by a torn strip of red leather, bearing the unmistakable brownish stain and sharp scent of iodine mixed with citrus, exactly as Vivienne had described from her recovered memory. "The evidence accumulates," Poirot observed quietly, his moustache twitching with grim satisfaction as he noted how James Ashford's face had gone pale at the sight of the familiar red leather. Poirot examined the strip of red leather with the delicate precision of a jeweler, appraising a rare gem, his green eyes noting every detail, the torn edge, the distinctive staining, and most significantly, the way James Ashford's face had drained of color at its appearance. "Most illuminating," he murmured, then allowed his gaze to drift toward the mahogany bookcase that lined the far wall. "Observe, mes amis," he continued, moving toward the lower shelf where leather-bound volumes stood in neat formation, save for one conspicuous gap. A parade of bindings, all similar in their crimson dress, yet here, like a widow keeps a chair for the departed, your library maintains a place for an absent friend. He ran one finger along the dusty outline where a book had once rested. "Monsieur Ashford, you maintain there is no red ledger, yet your own bookshelf tells a different story entirely." The color that had fled James's features now returned in a rush of crimson that matched the leather strip. "Old bindings are similar," he protested, his voice carrying a desperate edge. "You are reading significance into mere coincidence, Monsieur Poirot." "Ah, but ghosts do not leave iodine stains, monsieur," Poirot replied with deadly quietness, raising the leather strip toward Vivienne. "Madame, the scent you recalled from that night 6 months ago, it is precisely this, is it not? The sharp medicinal odor mixed with something citrus-like?" Vivienne nodded, her face pale but resolute. "Exactly that. I could never forget such a distinctive combination." "Lemon oil," Poirot observed, "which Higgins uses to polish the piano keys. Therefore, someone handled this ledger in this very room and wished us to discover only what they had, carefully arranged for our benefit." His attention suddenly shifted to Mrs. Hartwell, who had been unconsciously favoring her left hand throughout the evening. "Madame Hartwell, you have been most careful to avoid using your left hand. Perhaps you would be so kind as to show us your palm." The companion's face went ashen, and her remaining handkerchief fluttered forgotten to the carpet as she instinctively clutched her injured hand to her chest. "It's nothing. Merely a kitchen accident this morning. Kitchen accidents do not typically require treatment with iodine mixed with bergamot oil," Poirot interrupted smoothly, his penetrating gaze noting the fresh bandage beneath her glove and the telltale medicinal scent that clung to her person. "That particular combination is used for treating deep lacerations, the kind one might sustain when handling broken glass or sharp metal objects in darkness." Dr. Thornfield shifted uncomfortably, and Poirot's attention immediately focused on the elderly physician. "And you, Dr. the Clay, upon your cuff." Despite the formality of the evening, Thornfield glanced down, startled. "From the rose beds. I cut a bloom for Lady Vivienne at dusk, as I often do." "How gallant," Poirot replied with deceptive mildness, "and how convenient that the rose beds would be particularly muddy after such rain. Yet I observe no rose in this room, and Lady Vivienne wears no flower this evening." The silence stretched taut as piano wire, broken only by Vivienne's sudden, sharp intake of breath. "The thud," she whispered, her recovered memory aligning with the physical evidence before them. "The heavy book being placed on wood, it was here, wasn't it? The red ledger, set down hard upon this very piano." Her eyes moved from the torn leather strip to the gap in the bookshelf, the pieces of that terrible night finally forming a complete picture. They were here, the man and the woman whose voices I heard. They were standing exactly where we stand now, discussing my fate. James stepped forward aggressively, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the relentless pressure of accumulating evidence. This is madness. Someone is orchestrating this entire charade to frame me. But Poirot's moustache merely twitched with grim satisfaction as he noted how each revelation seemed to tighten an invisible noose around the truth. On the contrary, monsieur, someone has been most careless in their attempts to conceal the evidence of their crime. The question that remains is whether they will compound their original error with an even more desperate act before this night reaches its conclusion. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault upon Ashford Manor, but within the music room, Hercule Poirot had begun to weave the threads of evidence into a pattern that would soon reveal the identity of someone who had been willing to commit murder to keep their secrets buried forever. The mantel clock's bronze chimes drifted down from the drawing room above, each note marking another step toward the mysterious correspondent's midnight deadline. Poirot counted each tone with the precision of a conductor following a complex score, and when the 11th chime faded into the storm's relentless rhythm, his green eyes held a new intensity that seemed to illuminate the shadows gathering in the music room's corners. 1 hour remains, he observed with characteristic precision, then turned his attention to Higgins, who had remained standing near the doorway with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to witnessing his betters' dramas unfold. "Tell me, mon ami, who requested that the piano keys be polished with lemon oil?" The butler's trained composure flickered slightly. "Mrs. Hartwell, sir. She insisted the keys be cleaned before Lady Vivienne's afternoon practice session yesterday. And the iodine mixed with bergamot oil, such a distinctive combination. From whence did this particular preparation come?" "Doctor." Thornfield shifted uncomfortably, his medical bag seeming to grow heavier in his grip. "I requested it from the village chemist when my own supply ran low. The bergamot aids in preventing infection while masking the harsh medicinal odor that some patients find distressing." "How thoughtful," Poirot murmured, his moustache twitching with what might have been grim satisfaction. "And the player-piano mechanism, when was it last serviced?" James stepped forward, his businessman's instincts recognizing the methodical nature of an interrogation that was building toward some inevitable conclusion. "Last week, I had the entire mechanism cleaned and adjusted. It had been playing certain passages incorrectly." "Ah, but tonight it performed with perfect precision, did it not?" Poirot moved toward Mrs. Hartwell with the measured pace of inevitability itself. "Madam, your glove, if you please." The companion's face went ashen, but years of service had taught her the futility of refusing such a request. With trembling fingers, she removed her left glove, revealing a bandage that bore telltale stains of the same medicinal preparation that clung to the torn leather strip. "I caught it on the window latch when I was airing the room," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. "In such rain?" James demanded, his own desperation seizing upon any deflection from the mounting evidence. "You would have been soaked through." "Precisely," Poirot agreed quietly, examining the torn seam at the glove's palm where metal fragments glittered like accusatory stars. "And yet, the damage to your hand suggests contact with broken glass or sharp metal, the kind one might encounter when forcing a window latch in darkness, perhaps while retrieving something that had been hastily concealed." "Doctor," Thornfield cleared his throat with professional authority. "The clay upon my sleeve came from cutting across the rose beds from my motor car to spare my arthritic joints, the longer walk around the drive." "Yet the drive is paved with gravel," Poirot observed with deceptive mildness, "and would provide far better footing in such weather than muddy flower beds, unless, of course, one's true destination lay not within the manor's front entrance, but rather at a specific window that required preparation." The silence stretched taut as piano wire, broken only by Vivienne's sudden, sharp intake of breath as the fragments of that terrible night 6 months ago began forming a complete picture in her recovered memory. Her voice gaining strength as understanding dawned. "The amendments to the family trust, they would have given James complete control of my inherited shares in the shipping company. I had hesitated to sign them, sensing something was wrong with the terms. James stiffened, his carefully maintained composure finally showing cracks under the relentless pressure of accumulating evidence. The amendments were for the company's protection during a spelt difficult financial period. Your hesitation was unfortunate timing. Bon, Poirot said with quiet satisfaction, his penetrating gaze moving from face to face like a chess master contemplating his next move. Then we shall adjourn to Monsieur Ashford's study, where we may examine these mysterious papers that someone was so eager to have signed or prevent from being signed that they were willing to commit murder to achieve their goal. As the group prepared to leave the music room, Poirot paused beside the silent piano, his keen eyes noting a detail that others had missed entirely. The metronome, which should have been ticking with mechanical precision, sat frozen, mid-beat, stopped by an unseen hand at exactly the moment when someone had realized that Vivienne Ashford's memory was returning, and with it, the power to destroy carefully laid plans that had taken 6 months to mature. The detective's mustache twitched with grim anticipation as he realized that their anonymous correspondent's midnight deadline was not merely a theatrical flourish. It marked the precise moment when someone would be forced to choose between exposure and a second, more desperate attempt at murder. James's study welcomed them with the masculine scents of leather and cold pipe tobacco, but Poirot's attention immediately fixed upon the fireplace where a pyramid of ash retained the ghostly outline of recently burned papers. The acrid smell of iodine mixed with bergamot oil still lingered in the air, creating an olfactory signature that matched perfectly with the evidence they had discovered throughout the manor. "Most illuminating," he murmured, using the brass tongs to extract a partially burned clasp from the ashes, red leather with the same distinctive staining pattern they had observed on the torn fragment in the music room. James made a strangled sound, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of accumulating evidence. Behind the massive mahogany desk, the safe door stood ajar, its steel surface still warm to the touch despite the evening's chill. "Curious that a man of your evident business acumen would leave such valuable documents exposed," Poirot observed, noting how Dr. Thornfield's hands trembled as he adjusted his grip on the medical bag. Within the safe's confines lay the missing red ledger, its pages bearing calculations in 2 distinct hands, one bold and masculine, the other delicate and feminine. Mrs. Hartwell pressed her injured hand more firmly against her side, leaving telltale medicinal stains upon her dark dress as the mantel clock chimed the half-hour, marking another step toward their anonymous correspondent's midnight deadline. Poirot lifted the red ledger from the safe with the reverence of a scholar handling an illuminated manuscript, his green eyes scanning the pages with microscopic attention. "Observe, mes amis. 2 distinct hands at work, one bold and masculine, documenting legitimate shipping, investments. But here," he traced a delicate finger along the margin annotations. He traced a delicate finger, investments. A feminine script, precise as a surgeon's blade, tracking every withdrawal from Madame Ashford's personal trust with mathematical perfection. Missus Hartwell's face had turned the color of old parchment. Her injured hand pressed more firmly against her side as medicinal stains spread across her dark dress like accusations made visible. The hand that managed Lady Vivienne's correspondence, her household accounts, but her daily affairs, Poirot continued with relentless precision. The hand that documented each unauthorized transfer, each carefully disguised embezzlement, nearly £50,000 over 3 years, funneled through dormant subsidiaries into accounts bearing the initials E. H. James stepped backward, as if struck. "Eleanor, but you've been with us for 5 years of faithful service," Poirot interrupted quietly. "Following 20 years managing the household of Lady Vivienne's parents, before their deaths left both ladies in reduced circumstances." The transition from trusted family retainer to mere paid companion must have been difficult to accept. Dr. Thornfield's medical bag trembled in his grip as understanding dawned. The riding accident, you said her memory loss was providential. Indeed, Doctor, for when Madame Ashford began questioning certain financial irregularities 6 months ago, a convenient accident ensured her silence. But memories, like truth itself, possess an inconvenient persistence. Poirot's moustache twitched as the mantel clock chimed the 3/4 hour, its bronze tones counting down the final minutes before their anonymous correspondent's midnight deadline would transform from threat into terrible reality. Mrs. Hartwell's composure crumbled like ancient parchment exposed to flame, her shoulders sagging under the weight of 5 years' carefully constructed deception. The injured hand she had been protecting throughout the evening now trembled openly, leaving fresh medicinal stains upon her dark dress as tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. She was going to dismiss me, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's relentless assault upon the manor's windows. After 25 years of devoted service to her family, she discovered the transfers and was going to cast me out without reference. Without pension, nothing but disgrace after a lifetime of loyalty. Poirot nodded with the grave understanding of one who had witnessed human desperation in all its forms. "So you arranged the riding accident?" he stated with quiet certainty, his green eyes noting how Dr. Thornfield had positioned himself near the study door with movements that suggested a man calculating his options. "It was meant to be temporary," Eleanor continued, her confession pouring forth like water through a broken dam. "Just long enough to replace the funds, to make everything right again." The mare was already skittish in storms, a simple matter to ensure she would bolt at the crucial moment. But Vivienne's memory returned too soon, and tonight she remembered everything, the voices, the ledger, the papers we discussed. James stepped forward, his face a mask of horrified realization as he stared at the woman who had managed his household with such apparent devotion. "You sent that threatening note? You've been manipulating all of us?" But Poirot raised one small, perfectly manicured hand, his moustache twitching with the satisfaction of a chess master who had anticipated his opponent's next several moves. "Non, Monsieur Ashford. Observe the evidence with the precision it deserves. The note was not sent by Madame Hartwell, the handwriting, the vocabulary, the precise medical terminology. Permanent burial is not the language of a desperate companion, but rather of someone with intimate knowledge of mortality itself." The elderly physician's face went ashen as Poirot's penetrating gaze fixed upon him with the intensity of a magnifying glass, focusing sunlight into a burning point of truth. "You have been most helpful, Doctor, treating Madame Hartwell's injured hand with your distinctive iodine preparation, cutting across the muddy rose beds to avoid being seen entering through the front door, even ensuring that Lady Vivienne's memory loss would be prolonged through your careful medical supervision." Dr. Thornfield's medical bag trembled in his grip, its brass clasps catching the firelight like accusing eyes. "I don't understand what you're suggesting, but I think you understand perfectly," Poirot interrupted with deadly quietness. "When Madame Hartwell's desperate attempt at murder failed, when Lady Vivienne survived the riding accident with only selective amnesia, you saw an opportunity, not merely to help conceal embezzlement, but to protect secrets of your own secrets that would be exposed if Lady Vivienne's memory fully returned and she began asking uncomfortable questions about her parents' final illness 3 years ago." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the storm's fury and the steady tick of the mantel clock counting down the final minutes before midnight. In that charged atmosphere, James Ashford's face transformed from confusion to dawning horror as he began to comprehend the full scope of the conspiracy that had been unfolding beneath his own roof. "The amendments to the trust," Vivienne whispered, her recovered memory now fitting the final pieces into place. "You both needed those papers, signed Eleanor, to legitimize the transfers she had already made." And you, Dr. Thornfield, to ensure that no one would ever investigate the circumstances of my parents' deaths too closely. Outside, lightning illuminated the study's tall windows with stark clarity, and in that brief, brilliant moment, Poirot's green eyes held the terrible knowledge of truth finally emerging from its carefully constructed shadows. The midnight deadline was no mere theatrical flourish. It marked the moment when two desperate conspirators would be forced to choose between exposure and one final, irrevocable act that would silence Lady Vivienne Ashford forever. Dr. Thornfield's medical bag tumbled from nerveless fingers, its brass clasps springing open with metallic finality to reveal the damning evidence within vials of morphine, arranged with clinical precision alongside the distinctive iodine preparation that had left its telltale signature throughout the manor. The elderly physician's distinguished facade crumbled like ancient parchment exposed to flame, revealing beneath it the haggard desperation of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. "You cannot prove anything," he whispered, but his voice carried no more conviction than autumn leaves before a winter gale. Lady Vivienne's parents died of natural causes, pneumonia complicated by their advanced age and weakened constitution. Poirot's moustache twitched with grim satisfaction as he studied the scattered medical supplies with the precision of a scholar examining illuminated manuscripts. Ah, but pneumonia that strikes two healthy individuals simultaneously, both succumbing within hours of each other, following the signing of a new will that transferred significant assets to an investment fund in which you, Doctor, held a substantial but carefully concealed interest, most convenient for those who stood to benefit from their deaths, and most easily achieved by one with intimate knowledge of respiratory suppressants and unrestricted access to their evening medications. Eleanor Hartwell's sobs had subsided into the hollow breathing of someone who had accepted her fate, yet her eyes remained fixed upon the morphine vials, with the desperate calculation of a cornered animal recognizing its final chance for escape. "It was never supposed to go this far," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's relentless assault. "Transfers were temporary. I would have replaced everything once the estate was properly settled and my position secured. But the estate settlement revealed irregularities that threatened to expose both your embezzlement and the doctor's medical interventions." Poirot continued with relentless precision, his green eyes noting how both conspirators had unconsciously positioned themselves between the assembled group and the study's only exit. Hence the necessity of ensuring Lady Vivienne's permanent silence through what would appear to be nothing more than a tragic riding accident on a stormy night. James Ashford stared from his wife to the two people he had trusted with his family's most intimate affairs, his face cycling through disbelief, betrayal, and dawning horror as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "The amendments to the trust," he said slowly, his businessman's mind finally grasping the intricate web of deception. "You both needed those papers," signed Eleanor to legitimize the transfers she had already made, "and you, Thornfield, to ensure that no uncomfortable questions would ever be asked about the circumstances surrounding my wife's inheritance." The mantel clock's bronze tones began their midnight countdown, each chime resonating through the study like a funeral knell echoing in a cathedral vault. As the 10th tone faded into the storm's fury, Dr. Thornfield's hand moved with subtle deliberation toward his scattered medical supplies, his movement speaking of desperate resolve rather than surrender. 2 minutes remain, Poirot observed with deadly quietness, his keen eyes cataloguing every shift in posture, every telltale gesture that betrayed the conspirators' intentions. "The question now, mes amis, is whether you will compound your original crimes with an act that would seal your fate beyond any possibility of clemency." Mrs. Hartwell rose from her chair, with movements that carried the fluid grace of desperation, her injured hand no longer concealed but displayed like a badge of her determination. The red leather ledger lay within arm's reach upon James's desk, its pages containing the mathematical proof of her betrayal and her only remaining bargaining chip in a game that had already claimed too many lives. Outside, lightning illuminated the study's tall windows with stark, theatrical brilliance. And in that brief moment of clarity, Hercule Poirot's expression held the terrible knowledge of truth finally emerging from its carefully constructed shadows. The midnight deadline was no mere dramatic flourish. It marked the precise moment when two desperate souls would be forced to choose between exposure and one final, irrevocable act that would silence Lady Vivienne Ashford forever, just as they had silenced her parents 3 years before. The 11th chime began to sound, its bronze voice cutting through the storm's fury like destiny itself, calling the final players to take their positions for the last, most dangerous act of this carefully orchestrated tragedy. The 12th chime of midnight hung in the air like a blade poised to fall, and in that crystalline moment, Dr. Thornfield's hand darted toward the scattered morphine vials with the desperate efficiency of a man who saw only one escape from the web of evidence that had ensnared him. Simultaneously, Mrs. Hartwell lunged for the red leather ledger, her injured hand forgotten in her frantic attempt to cast the damning record into the dying embers of the fireplace. But Hercule Poirot had not spent the evening merely as a passive observer of human folly. With surprising swiftness for a man of his diminutive stature, he intercepted Mrs. Hartwell's desperate lunge, his small but firm grip closing around her wrist with the authority of inevitable justice. "Non, madame," he said with quiet finality. "These little grey cells have worked too diligently to permit you to destroy the final threads of evidence." Instant. James Ashford, galvanized by the horrifying realization of how close he had come to losing his wife to the machinations of those he had trusted most completely, moved with unexpected speed to prevent Dr. Thornfield from reaching his intended oblivion. The morphine vial tumbled from the physician's nerveless fingers, its contents spreading across the Persian carpet like tears shed too late for redemption. "Do not trouble yourself with such dramatic gestures, Doctor," Poirot observed with characteristic precision, his moustache twitching as he surveyed the scene of justice finally achieved. "When I requested that the doors be secured earlier this evening, I also took the liberty of dispatching young Timothy from the stables with a message to Inspector Meadows at the village inn. The good inspector should be arriving momentarily, storm or no storm." Mrs. Hartwell collapsed back into her chair as if her strings had been severed, the red leather ledger slipping from her trembling fingers to strike the carpet with the soft thud of dreams finally surrendering to reality. Her sobs resumed with the hollow echo of someone who had accepted the inevitable reckoning that awaited her, while Dr. Thornfield swayed like a tree whose roots had been severed, the last of his pretenses stripped away by Poirot's relentless logic. "The case, mes amis," Poirot announced, his green eyes moving from face to face with the satisfaction of a master craftsman surveying completed work, "is simplicity itself, once one applies order and method to the chaos of human deception." Madame Hartwell, driven by desperation and a misguided sense of entitlement after years of faithful service, embezzled from Lady Vivienne's trust over a period of 3 years. When discovery became imminent, she arranged what she intended to be a fatal riding accident, relying upon Dr. Thornfield's medical expertise to ensure that any inconvenient memories would remain permanently suppressed. He paused, adjusting his perfectly straight tie with characteristic precision. But our good doctor had his own secrets to protect. 3 years ago, he administered a carefully calculated dose of respiratory suppressants to Lady Vivienne's parents, disguising their murders as natural deaths from pneumonia. The altered will they had signed shortly before their demise ensured that substantial assets would flow into investment funds where the doctor held carefully concealed interests. James moved to his wife's side, his protective instinct finally awakened to the full scope of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed his family. Vivienne's hand found his, their wedding rings catching the firelight as they stood together against the wreckage of their carefully ordered world. From the entrance hall came the sound of approaching footsteps and voices. Inspector Meadows and his constables, arriving despite the storm's fury, their heavy boots echoing through the manor's corridors like the measured tread of justice itself. When Lady Vivienne's memory began to return, Poirot continued as the authorities entered the study. Both conspirators recognized that their carefully constructed deceptions would crumble, hence tonight's theatrical warnings and desperate attempts to complete what the riding accident had failed to accomplish 6 months ago. As the constables moved to arrest the two defeated figures, Dr. Thornfield finally spoke, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man whose professional dignity had been stripped away by his own actions. "It began as mercy," he whispered, his distinguished facade crumbling like ancient parchment. "Her parents were suffering, and the financial arrangements seemed practical." "Non, mon ami," Poirot replied with gentle but implacable authority. "It began as vanity, the most dangerous dosage of all. The belief that one's judgment supersedes the natural order, that one's needs justify the ultimate transgression against human life." Outside, the storm that had raged throughout the night began to subside, the rain tapering to a gentle patter against the diamond-paned windows, as if nature itself recognized that the manor's dark secrets had finally been brought into the cleansing light of truth. The first faint hint of dawn appeared on the horizon, a pale grey promise chasing away the shadows that had clung to Ashford Manor for far too long. As Dr. Thornfield and Mrs. Hartwell were led away, their faces etched with the stark reality of their exposure, Poirot turned to Vivienne with the courteous bow that had become his signature gesture. "Madame, your memory has served you well. It has quite literally saved your life. It is a peculiar thing. Memory," he observed with philosophical satisfaction. "Sometimes it forgets to forget, and sometimes it remembers its death too late for the murderer, but precisely in time for justice." With characteristic precision, the little Belgian detective gathered his coat and moved toward the study door, leaving the Ashford family to face the quiet dawn of their new, unburdened truth. "Justice," he concluded with a final adjustment of his perfectly waxed moustache, "is merely truth set right, like a crooked painting returned to its proper alignment. And now, mes amis, the painting is straight once more." The storm had passed. The secrets had been revealed, and Hercule Poirot departed Ashford Manor with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose little grey cells had once again triumphed over the darkness that lurks in the human heart. Some memories, he reflected as his motor car carried him back toward London through the peaceful morning countryside, are indeed worth recovering, no matter how terrible the truths they reveal.